Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for a virtual Alumni Skills Series. This series connects you to experts in a variety of disciplines, and today we are going to learn the fundamentals of composting in your backyard. Well, my name is Molly Clevin, and I'm from the University of Minnesota Duluth Alumni Relations team. Today, we are going to learn effective ways to reduce food waste and start a backyard composting system with our guest speaker, Jonna Korpi from UMD Sustainability. Now to introduce our guest. Today, we will hear from Jonna Korpi. Jonna serves as the Sustainability Coordinator for UMD and enjoys being outside, soaking up the sun, and getting the most out of the wonderful 4 seasons here in northern Minnesota. Jonna is drawn to plants like milkweed and maple trees. What brings her joy is sharing self-reliant skills that improve people's health, well-being, and connection to the planet. It is now my pleasure to hand it over to Jonna.
Thanks for that great introduction, Molly. Hi, everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your day to attend this session on composting. I'm really excited to share some things with you and have a very lively chat as we get through the material. Number one, why compost? And as I talk through why we're going to compost, we're going to get to see our alumni director, Matt, working in his compost pile. So why should we compost? Well, number one, it's easy, it's fun, it's a natural form of recycling, and it's super useful. So it improves soil and plant health by returning nutrients to the soil, and it also provides lots of good nutrients within the soil in case you have, maybe a clay-based soil or sandy soil. Just gets things back to higher production for plants and other things to grow. Another bonus is that it saves money by reducing your trash bill. So as you compost more, you're going to be sending less to the landfill. And that also helps fight climate change, which is super important. So food and other compostable materials in a landfill don't break down the way that they would in a compost pile. It's an anaerobic breakdown, and so that creates methane when those things are breaking down without oxygen in a landfill. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It is about 25 times more harmful than carbon dioxide, and it accounts for about 10% of all of US greenhouse gas emissions. So the less methane we can create in a landfill, the better. So thinking about composting, I do want to throw out a caveat that composting is great. It's wonderful in and of itself, because 16 to 30% of Minnesota household trash that ends up in the landfill could be being composted instead. But it's something to keep in mind that it's just one way to address food waste. So this hierarchy from the EPA is a really helpful reminder of where composting sits in priority of reducing food waste. So at the top of the hierarchy of how to reduce food waste in the US is source reduction. So reducing the amount of extra that you're generating in your kitchen or that you're buying at the store and then ending up not using and it goes to waste. So that's the most important way to reduce food waste first. Second is donating what you don't use or sharing it with others. I know as we're looking to start gardening this spring, we always maybe overplant a little bit, or you have a really productive zucchini plant that you end up with a million extra gigantic zucchinis. So really encouraging you to share that with other folks or food banks that take fresh produce, different things like that. So feeding hungry people is a really important way to reduce food waste as well. And then feeding animals. So if you have animals or livestock or chickens or know a farmer that has animals, providing them with that excess food waste. And then composting after other options have been exhausted. And then of course at the very bottom is the landfill. Types of backyard composting setups. So in the first video, you saw Matt's composting setup in his backyard, and it's actually one of the more unique situations where he's actually digging into the soil, and it's not really a pile per se, it's an underpile, I guess. So he digs a hole and throws his food scraps in and then buries it and then lets it naturally processed that way. More common things that you might have seen are this 3-bin system, this wood pallet system. That's a super handy system. If you have enough space, you can have different piles and different stages of breakdown going all at once. Another common one is the 2 bins on the side. So the earth machine is one of the most popular ones in the US, where you add food scraps and things into the top, and then as things break down and you're turning it from the top, you get usable compost out the bottom. Another type of compost setup is the bin system that you see that's on legs, which makes it very accessible. You can add scraps into the top, and then you turn it and keep it aerated. It literally just turns like a rotisserie. So you just have to turn it a couple of times every couple of days. And it's a really easily accessible way to compost, especially if you have small space or critters are an issue. And then the one in the bottom left corner is my compost bin in my backyard. We bought a new house and had a ton of cinder block just kind of laying around in the yard. And so rather than paying to have those sent to the demolition landfill, construction waste landfill, we just repurposed those and made a relatively large compost pile in our backyard that we turn with a handy pitchfork. So there's lots of different things out there. There's really endless possibilities. If you're a person that feels comfortable kind of doing DIY projects, you can use pallets, different types of wire mesh setups like chicken wire. So you can make frames and use chicken wire to keep your compost contained. There's repurposing of 55-gallon drums or garbage cans. And then if you're an owner, you have a little bit more flexibility in the space that on the property that you own. But if you're a renter, the barrel composter takes up very little space, and it doesn't need to be like in contact with, you're not in contact with the ground. So you could even put it on your balcony. So that's another nice option for folks that maybe don't have access to as much land or property to have a compost bin in their backyard. And then thinking about pest control. So how many critters are around and could get into your compost is going to determine what type of compost bin you end up selecting. So obviously, with the open system like I have in my backyard, occasionally it has some disturbances, I would say, where something's obviously been in the pile and digging out a few things. But because of where it's located and the way that my yard's set up, I don't really mind too much. But for other folks, that might be a really big hassle and could have things strewn all about, maybe a really nicely manicured area. So thinking about, do you have the ability to fence off your compost bin? Or do you want one of these more contained style barrels? So lots of things to think about. And it's important that you find something that's going to work best for your situation, that's easily accessible, for you to dump scraps in on a regular basis, and then maintain it if you need to turn it. And then also keep those critters out. So then the next piece of composting is, what do you put in your compost? So there's a variety of basic ingredients that can be composted. And we're going to talk about that here. And Molly's going to drop a more complete list into the chat for your reference. But at a very basic level, you want browns, greens, and you need access to water and air. And browns are carbon sources. So those are dead leaves, twigs, wood chips, straw, shredded paper. So anything that's dry and has died, basically. Greens are a nitrogen source for your compost bin. So those are things like vegetable and food scraps, grass clippings, fresh grass clippings, coffee grounds, those types of things that they still have a lot of their moisture content and were recently still alive, if that makes sense. And then water is an important factor. So the microbes that are breaking down your compost require a little bit of water. There's a fine balance of how much water you need in your compost bin versus overwatering your compost bin. And then access to air. So that's where that turning of your compost pile becomes really important. So the microbes need to breathe. It's an aerobic process, breaking down all of that waste. And so making sure that whatever bin you choose, if it's an enclosed bin, making sure you're turning it so it's getting that extra airflow, or like with Matt's compost pile, digging into the dirt and turning it over with a shovel. I use a pitchfork, and then, doing that on a regular occasion. At minimum, once a week. With the barrel composters, they say every 2 to 3 days. So there's different needs depending on your setup as well. And we can go into way more depth of like all the other things that you can compost and that you shouldn't compost. Maybe we'll save that for the chat. Another question that people are often asking is, what's the recipe for composting? How much of one ingredient do you need versus another one? So your main ingredients are those browns and greens. And it's really a 2-to-1 ratio is a really simple way to remember it. So if you have a 5-gallon bucket of food scraps, you want to put 2 5-gallon buckets worth of dead leaves or different types of brown materials in order to keep a good ratio. So when you're starting your pile or your bin or your barrel, the best way to get started is consider a layering setup. So starting with a layer of browns and then greens, and at each layer adding just a little bit of soil or maybe existing compost between the layers to get those microbes kind of getting the party started, I would say. And then also giving the whole mix a little bit of water to help things get cooking as well, because just a dry environment does not necessarily promote those microbes to start breaking things down. So as you're layering, at the last layer, you want to make sure that you're covering any food scraps with a layer of browns, which will help also to deter pests from digging into the pile, and keeping that in mind as you're adding in the future too. Whenever you're adding your food scraps, whether you're turning browns from the top and then you're burying your new stuff into the pile, that will help prevent pests from digging into there as well. And then with the compost, at my house, like I said, I turn it about once a week, and that's when I empty my food scraps, just because my container fits about a week's worth of compostable stuff. So usually on a Saturday or Sunday, I'll get out there and turn the compost and add the new things. With summertime arriving and having more maybe grass clippings or other gardening waste, it'll probably be more like twice a week. And then with a barrel, probably turning every 2 to 3 days to make sure things are super active and getting enough aeration. And then if you don't have a lot of the browns, especially in the summer because everything is so green, you can use other sources of carbon materials like paper bags, shredded paper, different things like that. So just keeping that in mind. Some people will keep their leaves from the fall to add to their compost pile, and the spring as they know they're going to be mixing a lot. So that's something to keep in mind for this fall if you are starting a relatively big compost pile and you have the space to save leaves for jump starting your compost pile in the spring. That would be great too. Critter proofing your compost. So this is a lot of questions came in ahead of the session about how to, am I going to attract rodents or bears or different types of animals? How do I prevent this, and how does that whole bit work? So we talked a little bit about this already in the selection of your bin. So, picking a bin that is maybe critter proof in itself is important if you're really concerned about it. And then if you have a space that can be fenced off, that would be another way to prevent critters from getting in there. But one big way that people prevent critters getting into their compost is not putting meat or bones or dairy products in the bin. those tend to be more attractive to critters, and they will dig through a pile in order to get to some of those things. But I've also had mystery critters dig into my pile for pineapple scraps and different things. So it really just depends, like, did you bury it well enough? Do you have enough browns covering it to keep any odors, whether good odors that would attract rodents or bad odors that, are maybe unattractive to yourself or your neighbors. So keeping those things in mind will help abate some of that critter issue. But obviously, we don't want what is happening in this picture to happen in your backyard. So avoiding that, if at all possible, by doing some planning ahead. And then just some best practices. So there's a couple ways to really make sure that your compost is surviving well. So decomposition of organic material happens on the surface of materials. So the more surface area available to the microbes, the faster things will break down, which is why you want to chop things into smaller pieces to give more surface area for those microbes to start breaking down. It doesn't have to be teeny tiny bits, but if you had, say, one of those giant zucchinis at the end of the fall, rather than chucking the whole zucchini in, maybe slicing it into like cubes of, say, a couple inches or smaller, so that they're really not this big hunk that the microbes have to try to break down. As you can see, the picture that I have on the slide is from my compost bin. As I was turning it 2 weeks ago, I discovered 3 generations of pineapple tops that were in different states of breakdown because they're large. They're just a harder thing for the microbes to break down. They will eventually get there, but they were definitely the most obvious thing that was not breaking down. Another thing that takes a lot longer to break down are corn cobs. They will break down. I only found 1 corn cob in my pile from last fall that made it through the winter. But again, that's one of those things that if it's hard to cut and it's hard to make into those smaller pieces, you might want to maybe take it to the bigger composting site here in town if you live in Duluth, or an industrial composting facility, or just maybe not put those in your compost bin if you're worried about that, having those big chunks. Another best practice is maintaining moisture. So it's really easy for compost piles to dry out. So don't be afraid to add a little bit of water, or if you have an open pile, like mine was in the backyard, you can put a tarp over it to try to keep moisture from evaporating and keep it a little bit more moist, especially over the last couple of weeks. I know my compost pile has been pretty dry because we haven't had any rain. So I actually just took my watering can and watered my compost pile last weekend. And now it's going to be, having plenty of moisture over the next couple of days as it starts to rain. And then helping it breathe. So it needs to breathe no matter if it's a barrel or a pile. We've talked about this already. So making sure that you're turning it, whether it's with a pitchfork or a shovel, mixing things about really does help the breakdown process. And then the last thing is keeping it hot. So a compost pile works most effectively when the internal temperature of the compost is between 130 degrees Fahrenheit and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything lower than that, it's going to be a really slow composting process, and anything higher than that, you're going to kill off your microbes that are working so hard to break down that compost. And the best way to keep that pile hot, and the way the pile gets hot, is that the microorganisms that are feeding on the waste are producing heat. So in order to keep that temp, your pile should be of a certain size and have enough material of both greens and browns to make sure that that's staying hot. You can buy a compost thermometer to try to monitor the temperature of your compost pile, or you're experiencing some issues with your pile, and there are ways to troubleshoot that. But for the most part, like if you feel like things are breaking down and you're not having any of those issues, then I don't think it's entirely necessary to monitor the data too regularly. So this really is like you can be a complete beginner. You don't have to have any expertise in order to maintain your pile. Another question that comes up often is how long does the composting process take in a backyard situation? Typically, an actively turned pile or bin will take about 3 to 4 months to break down fully even as you're adding new materials. That being said, like if you are having any of those issues where your pile is super dry or maybe super wet or isn't getting hot enough, that all is going to take a little bit longer. Or, if you're turning it more often, it might take less time. But when you'll know it's ready when you're getting to that bottom picture where you're unable to recognize individual materials. It smells like earthy dirt, like the kind of compost that you would get maybe at a home improvement store, and it's dark brown or black in color. So in that middle picture, you can see that, there's still some identifiable things, maybe banana peels or orange peels or coffee filters or different things like that. So it's not quite ready yet. And then for best processing, compost needs to rest and cure. And so while you can use compost directly, when you feel like it's ready and just adding it as you go, there are some benefits to letting it rest and kind of settle down as those microorganisms are still active in the compost. So if you have the space and the time to wait to use your compost, you can always move finished compost to a different pile and cover it or put it somewhere else so that it can sit while you're adding more compost to your bin or your pile that will keep getting actively used. Another thing to think about is if backyard composting is unavailable to you. And if you live in Duluth, you'll see me walking to one of our drop sites. This is at Sarah's Table in the Chester Creek neighborhood. They have worked with our local Western Lake Superior Sanitary District, who has an industrial compost site. And they are one of like 8 publicly available drop sites. And they'll also give you free compostable bags. And then you just bring your scraps to the drop site and then use the food waste only dumpster. And then in order to get compost, you can go down to WLSSD's composting site and buy Garden Green, which is their compost product, at very reasonable prices. And it's much more advantageous to bring a couple of 5-gallon buckets, or if you have a truck and you can fill a truck bed full of compost, it's much cheaper. I mean, I think it's like $5 or $6 to fill up 5 or 6 5-gallon buckets is the last time I got compost down there. So buying it in bulk versus buying it bagged at different sites around town is really reasonable. So if you have the ability to get down there and access that bulk purchasing of compost from WLSSD, it's a great resource for the Duluth community. And you're still getting all the benefits of backyard composting. So you're saving money by reducing your trash bill, still fighting climate change by keeping things out of the landfill, and recycling that which would have been a waste product. So it's a great alternative for folks that either don't have the space or just don't want to deal with, maybe having a backyard compost site, or maybe you live in an apartment, things like that. So it's a really great resource. Another question that came in was about vermicomposting. And so vermicomposting is the use of earthworms to convert organic waste into fertilizer. And it has all the benefits of backyard composting plus a few additional others. It requires very little labor and maintenance. It has a small footprint in terms of the space required. You can have a vermicomposting bin that would fit, under your sink or, in a closet. Some folks that we've talked to even have a vermicomposting setup under their bed because they live in an efficiency apartment. And so they're really limited on space. And you can keep it indoors all year round. And then if you enjoy fishing, you also have a supply of fishing worms because there are typically about 500 worms to start in a vermicomposting bin setup. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on the worms, but I do have some great resources that is included in the document that Molly shared earlier about vermicomposting, especially a local person who loves to talk about worm composting and has tons of resources and has a great website. So her information is included in there, but really basic equipment and supplies. So a worm bin that has air holes, bedding like shredded newspaper, worms. So you use red wigglers are the most popular, and then food scraps. So pretty similar to a compost bin setup, just a couple of different nuances to consider if you want to go that route as well. So those are the basics of composting. And now I would love to open it up to question and answer and see what folks are thinking about.
Well, thank you so much, Jonna, for the demonstration and composting lessons. We are going to start our videos now and start our question and answer. So to get us started, the first question is asking, what are the best ways to compost at a rental property? And I know you had mentioned a little bit earlier about this, but wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, so like I said, the barrel composter, if you at least have a balcony, that would be a great option for a rental site, or if it's a house, a shared house situation. You know, a lot of our students live in rental housing, and so they are living on a bigger property, but not necessarily feeling like they can do anything that would be permanent or even semi-permanent, like a compost pile. So a barrel composter is a really handy tool for those folks. And again, being able to use our drop sites. Those are located all across town, from way out in West Duluth by the Munger Trail Inn to up in Woodland and at Sarah's Table. The Lincoln Park neighborhood has the actual composting facility, so there's access there as well. So that's the other one. And then if you want to check out the vermicomposting, there are worms available, and that's a pretty low impact. A little bit harder to deal with if you want to move. I don't know what you do with your worms if you make that a priority if you move from your rental, but again, another really accessible thing for renters.
Awesome, thanks. Oh, we just got in the chat that apparently there's a new company in Duluth that's doing compost pickup. So almost like a garbage service. So
really, that's amazing.
Yeah, so something else to consider.
Great.
Our next question is wondering about the soil. So this person asked, the soil is very acidic, so there's lots of cedar and pine on the property. Do I need to boost it with mulch, and can it be yard leaves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it depends on what you are wanting the yard to do. So some plants really thrive in acidic soils. And so that might not be a bad thing. It just really depends on what folks are looking to plant, whether they're vegetables or annuals or perennials. Those needs are all dependent on the particular plant that you're hoping to add to the soil. But mulching is a good thing. A mix of mulch and compost. There's a lot of different factors to be considered in that. But having acidic soils isn't necessarily a terrible thing. It just depends on what you're trying to grow. So
another question that just came in, this person uses a wood stove and wondering if they can use the ashes in the compost.
Yes, so in a limited amount. I don't have a ton of data on that in particular, but I know you can add a little bit of wood ash, but there is a point where it might overwhelm the microbes and actually negatively impact them. So I would say sparingly, yes, but there's definitely more in-depth resources to talk about the wood ash piece. But on a base level, yes, you can. But just being aware that you can't just dump like a huge 5-gallon bucket of ash into your compost pile and things will turn out okay. Probably won't.
Good to know. And actually, the next couple of questions also are just wondering about different types of things to include in your compost. And the one asked, are paper towels and napkins considered brown and green?
Yes, I would consider that a brown and a green, or a brown, sorry, because they are more in their carbon form versus their living form. And that's something that's nice about having a backyard compost bin, being able to add those things in certain amounts. WLSSD has limits on what they will accept in terms of some of those paper products. Like for instance, they don't want pizza boxes, which I'm going to show my little no plug for Pizza Luce, but they do say right on their box, this box and liner are 100% compostable. And which is true, they are, but our compost site is right next to a biogas plant, and there's concern that in a hot compost pile, as hot as the industrial compost pile gets, that a greasy pizza box may start on fire, and you do not want to fire next to a biogas plant. And so just being aware that, like, depending on what your setup is or what the bigger community composting site is, there's going to be some nuances on what you can compost and what they would prefer you not put in your compost. But in a home composting site, you could also put a pizza box in, but again, that's going to be something that's going to take a long time because it's a large surface area thing. So if you want to take the time to cut up a pizza box and throw it in your compost bin, you could do that. But at the rate that I eat pizza, I don't think my compost bin can handle that. So I'm just keeping mine to, I've been kind of collecting them over the winter to do some site prep for some raised beds, which is they're a good weed control option as well. So being creative in how you use some of those materials is helpful.
So another question, wondering about seeds that you remove from veggies and fruit. Can you put the seeds directly in the compost, and would that affect the composting at all?
I do. It depends on your setup. So like, again, a compost pile will get very hot if it's an actively managed compost pile. And so it will probably kill off the germinating capabilities of those seeds. However, if you have just a giant pile, like at our UMD farm, at the end of the season, they'll throw in the zucchinis and the pumpkins and anything that was spoiled during the fall. And oftentimes in the springtime, they have beautiful zucchini plants growing out of their compost pile on the edges because it hasn't hit that temperature where it would have killed off the seeds. So some things will germinate depending on your pile setup, but for the most part, seeds and different things like that are fine. But just knowing, like, an avocado pit, that's something that's commonly I find in my compost pile that's not breaking down because it's a solid big piece, or like a mango pit. So those things just will take a lot longer to break down.
And wondering about weeds. So putting your weeds, we know that you can put leaves in, but what about weeds?
Yes, great question. So weeds are tricky. So they're problematic because they are so able to survive lots of things, right? And we want to get them out of our yards. But in a backyard composting setup, it might not get hot enough to kill off weed seeds, whereas a vegetable seed is a lot more susceptible to temperature things. So if you have weeds that are really problematic, I would say maybe err on the side of caution and not put them in your compost bin, because if the green parts get broken down and the seeds are still viable and you put that compost out into your garden or your your planting area, then you may just have given the weeds just like free reign to explode again into your space that was probably really well manicured and ready for not weed plants. So I would be careful with that. But in Duluth, like WLSSD does have yard waste drop off that you can, kind of bulk drop off some of those weeds or other yard trimmings. And there's some haulers in town too that you can work with that will do curbside pickup for bigger yard waste, not necessarily compost or like not food scraps, but bigger yard waste too. So that's an option as well.
So you had talked about the different ingredients to composting, and you mentioned that it needs a little bit of water. So how often should you be watering and adding that to your compost?
Yeah, so a lot of the things on the internet will say, well, if you can squeeze like a drop of water out of if you take a handful out of your compost and you can squeeze a drop of water, like then it's moist enough. But I'm really hesitant to just like stick my hand into my compost pile in order to see how moist it is. So I usually just use my eyes as my sensory guide, and as I'm turning my pile, I just try to see like if it looks like it's I mean, obviously you're going to be able to tell if it's over wet, it's real sloppy and almost like mud, then it's really way too wet, and you want to add a lot more browns to that and try to balance that out. And one of the downsides of it being too wet is it's going to start to smell like manure or other really foul smelling things. And so that one's going to be probably the more obvious one. But whether it's too dry, it's really just a texture thing. So yeah, you just want to, I just visually see like if it's like really dusty or crumbly when I'm turning it, then I will usually add just a little bit of water. But if it seems like it's all kind of sticking together and has a little bit of cohesion and looks a little bit more like soil moisture content, if that makes sense, then I feel like it's probably okay.
Perfect. A few more questions about what you can and cannot throw in the bin. Moldy food. What are your thoughts?
Yes, you can definitely throw moldy food in there. And that's one of those things where it's like, if it's a really big moldy thing, if you feel you're not grossed out by how moldy it is, or if it's so moldy that's going to just fall apart anyway, then I wouldn't worry about cutting it up. But if it's something larger, trying to maybe chop it into smaller pieces before you throw it in the compost bin too.
Perfect. And then raw eggshells. Is that okay? Do they need to cook the eggshells?
So eggshells, empty eggshells are fine to go in the compost bin. It's if you have, say, a whole carton of eggs that you forgot about for a month and you're like, I'm pretty sure these are bad, I'm going to throw them in the compost bin. You can, but that is one of those things where it might attract critters or might create some really interesting smells coming from your compost pile. So just some things to be thinking about. So you can do that. They don't have to be cooked ahead of time, but just knowing that it may create some issues in terms of critters or smells. But try to bury it really well if you're going to do a whole raw egg in there.
Wondering if you can go over a little bit more on the curing process and how best to do that.
Yeah. So honestly, it's just like you set your compost in a secure area where you feel like it's not going to be disturbed by anything, and it shouldn't attract critters because it's really just dirt at that point. But just giving it its own area and leaving it alone. If you're worried about it drying out or anything like that, so maybe tarping it, putting some sort of a cover over it, different things like that. But it's really just like setting it aside and forgetting about it for 6 to 12 weeks. That's how the industrial composting facilities do it as well. Once the compost gets to a certain point, and they'll just start sifting through it, so that, you know, at a bigger facility, you know, they might be having compostable spoons and forks that haven't broken down yet. So they sift out a lot of that stuff to be reprocessed, but then they just let their compost sit for a significant number of weeks before they bag it up or let people come take it. Yeah, in the bulk section.
Well, knowing that we live in northern Minnesota, composting through the winter, is there only a certain time of year that's conducive up here, or can you do it all year round?
Yeah, so with my composting setup, and you all saw a picture of that, I continue to add compost all winter long, even when there is snow on top of it. And I don't know that the pile stayed hot, but even if it kind of goes dormant over the winter, like if it gets so cold that it like all activity stops, you can keep adding things if you have the space, and then just do some really good turning right away in the spring as things unthaw, because the entire pile is, you know, kind of frozen through. So as things thaw out, you're giving a good turn, and it'll just kick back up into gear once the temperatures are more conducive for the microbes to be active. I don't know how that looks for the, you know, maybe like the earth machine composter or the barrel setups. The barrel, at least if you had a basement, you could probably move that indoors without a whole lot of issue to use it throughout the winter. But those smaller bins that are going to freeze through faster are going to be less viable over the winter. Whereas a bigger pile you can keep adding to and just kind of kick it back into gear in the spring. So it's really kind of personal preference. Some people don't want to, you know, hike through the snow in their yard to put their food scraps out. So that's another piece that you can still do a drop site around Duluth all throughout the year. So maybe switching your tactics into the winter if that's more accessible to you.
Perfect. Well, and I think this last question will be our final. But how do different types of composting affect the odor?
Guess I'm not entirely sure. I mean, like maybe in terms of materials. Hope I'm getting the vein of that appropriately.
So is there a difference between using a bin versus using the, you know, the like what you've got with the cinder blocks where it's open?
Yeah, I feel like the bins, so long as they're actively turned, are going to be pretty low odor, pretty low intensity, and so long as they're not getting too wet or too dry. It's really if you have the right setup and the right controls. So when anything gets out of balance is when you're going to have smells. So I think it's not necessarily a difference between the type of composting setup. It's just that you're maintaining whatever setup you have appropriately. And in that resource document that I had you share, Molly, there's a link to a backyard composting kind of within one of those links. It has some troubleshooting. So, you know, if the pile smells a certain way, it might be because it's too wet. And if it smells this way, it might be because of X, Y, or Z. So there's like a whole chart of how to troubleshoot if you're having smells. With my compost pile, I've never noticed the smell. Granted, it is like as far back on our property as possible, so it's kind of close to our alley. But I also try to keep a lot of cover of browns on top of the compost pile and keep it mixed really well. So I've never noticed any issues, but I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why a compost bin will smell, but it shouldn't smell, if that makes sense. If all things are going according to nature.
And yeah, just I know that you'd mentioned the handout, so there was some challenges opening up that document. So we will send that in an email. We'll get that squared away so that everyone can have access to the supplemental materials. But
perfect. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. But we will get that emailed out here shortly. And I guess with that, I just want to extend a great big thank you to you, Jonna, for taking the time to share with us. I know there were other questions that were not answered today. So if you would like to learn more about composting and other programs offered through UMD's Office of Sustainability, feel free to reach out to Jonna directly with the email on the screen here. Also, if you're not an alum of UMD, we do average about 1 to 2 of these virtual programs a month. And if you would like to be added to our event mailing list, please email us at alumni@d.umn.edu. So again, thank you so much, Jonna, and we hope that you will join us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun. I like talking about compost.
Good. All right, thank you.
Excellent.